The envelope was lying on the porch when I returned from my weekly trip to the grocery store. Thick paper, the official seal of the district court. Letters like this never bring good news. I put the bags down by the door and carefully opened the envelope with trembling fingers. At 70, your hands don't listen like they used to, especially when you're nervous. The words on the form blurred before my eyes. Summons to appear in court. Defendant, Evelyn Callahan. Plaintiffs, Tabitha Foster and Reginald Foster. I reread the first lines 3 times before it sank in. My own daughter was suing me. The charges sounded absurd: stalking, invasion of privacy, and trespassing. I sank down on the porch steps, oblivious to the cold October wind. Tabitha accused me of allegedly following her and her husband, showing up at their house uninvited, and creating an atmosphere of psychological pressure. Their house? I've lived in this house for 45 years. Gerard and I bought it when Tabitha was only 3 years old. She learned to walk on these wooden floors and scratch the paint off the walls with her children's toys. After my husband died 5 years ago, this house became my only constant companion. Every room held memories, from my daughter's first steps to Gerard's last days when he could no longer climb the stairs to the second floor. My memory helpfully brought up an image from 2 years ago. Tabitha stood in the doorway with a suitcase in her hands and tears on her cheeks. Reginald had lost his job at an advertising agency, and they couldn't afford to pay for a rented apartment. "Mom, we just need a little time to get back on our feet," she said at the time. "Just a couple of months until Reggie finds something suitable." Her voice was trembling, her eyes red from crying. She looked so vulnerable that my heart ached. I let them in, of course. What mother would refuse to help her own daughter? Even considering our complicated relationship history, I couldn't leave her out on the street. Tabitha had always been a demanding child, capricious, stubborn, accustomed to getting what she wanted by any means necessary. At school, she would throw tantrums at her teachers if she got bad grades. In college, she would call me in tears every time she had a fight with her friends or boyfriends. At the same time, she knew how to be charming when she needed to be. Teachers forgave her antics, and her classmates gravitated toward her despite her unpredictable nature. She married Reginald at 28, an interior designer with the manners of a provincial aristocrat and a habit of promising more than he could deliver. He was tall, thin, with a neatly trimmed beard and a habit of wearing expensive suits even at home. He spoke beautifully, with refined turns of phrase, but his words often concealed emptiness. Gerard disliked him from the very beginning. "This man lives in a world of his own fantasies," my husband said after meeting his son-in-law for the first time. A couple of months turned into 2 years. At first, I didn't mind. The house was big. There was enough room for everyone. Tabitha cooked dinner. Reginald helped with minor repairs. We even got along quite well, at least for the first 6 months. My daughter talked about her plans. Reginald shared his ideas for redecorating the interior. It seemed that we had finally become a real family, something we hadn't been even when Tabitha lived at home. Then something changed. My daughter became irritable and answered simple questions sharply. Reginald began to make comments about how I ran the household, where I kept things, what programs I watched on TV. "Evelyn, don't you think that music at 9 o'clock in the evening might disturb the neighbors?" he would say when I played Gerard's old records. At the same time, he himself could talk on the phone until midnight, discussing projects in a voice that could be heard throughout the house. "Mom, don't you think it's time to redecorate?" Tabitha would say, looking critically around the living room. "This wallpaper has been here since the 80s. She was right. The wallpaper was really old, but it was our wallpaper with Gerard, part of our life together. We had chosen it in a small shop on the outskirts of town, arguing about the color, laughing at the salesperson's advice. Changing it seemed like a betrayal of his memory. Gradually, I began to feel like a guest in my own home. Tabitha and Reginald set their own rules: when to have dinner, what programs to watch, what time to go to bed. They didn't say it directly, but their dissatisfaction was evident in every glance, every sigh. I tried not to cause any problems, giving in on small things, hoping that the situation was temporary. The situation finally deteriorated last spring. I went to stay with my sister Dorothy in Richmond for 2 weeks. She had been diagnosed with a heart condition and needed help. Dorothy had always been frail, even in her youth. After her illness, she became completely helpless, afraid to be left alone even for an hour. Tabitha volunteered to look after the house, water the flowers, and collect the mail. "Of course, Mom, we'll take care of everything," she said with a smile I remembered from my childhood. When I returned, I sensed that something was wrong. Small things. The furniture in the bedroom had been rearranged. The family photos had disappeared from the dresser, and there were new curtains in the kitchen. The photo of our wedding with Gerard, which had always stood on the nightstand, was gone. Instead, there was a vase with artificial flowers. "We just wanted to surprise you," my daughter explained with that fake smile I knew from childhood. "Don't you think it's cozier now?" I didn't argue. Maybe they really did mean well, but I never found the photo. Tabitha answered my questions evasively. She had forgotten where she put it, or she thought I had put it away myself. In the end, she admitted that she had accidentally broken the frame and lost the photo while trying to fix it. She had simply lost the photo of my father and me on our wedding day. In the summer, I went to visit Dorothy again, this time for a month. My sister had become depressed after her operation and needed moral support. The doctors said she might have a stroke if she didn't learn to cope with stress. I couldn't abandon my only relative in that state. When I returned, I found that the locks on the house had been changed. "For security," Reginald said, handing me the new keys. "There have been a lot of burglaries in the neighborhood." I didn't remember any burglaries, but I kept quiet. It would have been silly to argue about the locks on my own house, but something made me suspicious. The new locks were expensive, modern, clearly not the kind you put in for temporary protection. Reginald explained that he had found them at a discount and couldn't pass up the opportunity. At the same time, the old locks disappeared without a trace. Usually, locksmiths leave them with the owners just in case. In the fall, my trips to Dorothy's became regular, every 2 weeks. My sister didn't cope well with loneliness, and I couldn't abandon her in that state. Besides, the doctor recommended regular communication as part of her therapy. Every time I returned home, I noticed new changes. The old lamp in the living room disappeared. Strange books appeared on the shelves. Someone rearranged the dishes in the kitchen cabinets. Tabitha explained this as concern for my comfort, a desire to freshen up the atmosphere. Once, I couldn't find the box with Gerard's documents, insurance policies, will, family papers. The box had always been in the bedroom closet on the top shelf. "We moved it to a safer place," Tabitha explained. But she forgot to show me where, and then said she didn't remember exactly where she had put it. The documents were found only a week later in the basement, among the old things we were going to throw away. The last time I visited my sister was 3 weeks ago. Dorothy was finally feeling better and no longer needed constant care. She planned to stay at home for a long time, maybe until spring. On the very first evening, Tabitha announced that it was time for her and Reginald to move out. "We found a great apartment in the center," she said, avoiding my gaze. "Reg got a big order, so now we can afford something decent." I was delighted, not because I wanted to get rid of my daughter, but because I would finally be able to return to my normal life in my own home. I would be able to listen to Gerard's music again, watch old movies, and have breakfast whenever I wanted. But they didn't move out. Week after week, Their things remained in their rooms. Tabitha answered questions evasively. The apartment wasn't ready yet. There were problems with the paperwork. Reginald was busy with an important project that couldn't be interrupted. And now this summons, accusations of harassment and interference in someone else's life. I reread the document hoping to find an explanation. There wasn't one. Only cold legal wording and the date of the hearing. In 2 weeks. It was getting dark. Neighbors were returning from work. Lights were coming on in the houses across the street. I sat on the porch with the court summons in my hands, trying to understand how I had gotten to this point. Where had I gone wrong? What was my fault? All I had done was help my own daughter and take care of my sick sister. Tabitha hadn't been home for 3 days. Neither had Reginald. Maybe they really had moved into that apartment in the city center. Or maybe they just didn't want to see me before the trial. In any case, the house felt empty and unfamiliar without them there. Even hostility is better than complete loneliness. The cold wind forced me to get up from the porch. The groceries were still standing by the door. The milk could spoil. I picked up the bags and went inside. The hallway greeted me with silence and the smell of someone else's perfume. Tabitha always wore too much perfume, and now the smell seemed especially intrusive. As I put the groceries in the refrigerator, I noticed that the magnet with Gerard's photo was gone. It was a small black and white card that he carried in his wallet. After his death, I had attached it to the refrigerator. It made it seem like he was still there, watching over my life, approving of my decisions. Now, only advertising magnets and notes with phone numbers adorned the refrigerator. A stranger's life in my house. I walked into the living room and sat down in Gerard's favorite chair. The summons was still lying on my lap. In 2 weeks, I would have to explain to the judge why my own daughter considered me a threat to her family. I woke up that morning thinking that everything that was happening was a bad dream, but the summons was lying on the bedside table, reminding me of the reality of the situation. 2 weeks until the trial. I needed a lawyer, and I had no idea where to start. I had never had to deal with legal proceedings in my entire life. The first thing I did was call Dorothy. My sister listened to me in silence, only occasionally interjecting with sympathetic exclamations. Evi, I always said there was something wrong with Tabitha, she finally said. Remember how she behaved at Gerard's funeral? She was more concerned with how she looked in her black dress than with her mother's grief. It was true, although at the time I tried not to pay attention to it. Tabitha really did care more about her appearance than about supporting the family. She spent the whole day touching up her makeup and complaining about her uncomfortable shoes, while I accepted condolences and tried to maintain my composure. Dorothy advised me to contact Harold Britton, the family lawyer who had helped her during her divorce 20 years ago. He's not young anymore, but he's honest and experienced, my sister said. And, most importantly, he won't charge too much. Britton's office was located in an old building in downtown Georgetown. A narrow staircase, creaky steps, the smell of old furniture and tobacco. The lawyer himself turned out to be a gray-haired man of about 65 with kind eyes behind thick glasses. He listened to my story attentively, occasionally nodding and making notes in his notebook. Mrs. Callahan, he finally said, I'm afraid the situation is more serious than it seems at first glance. If your daughter has filed a lawsuit for invasion of privacy, she may be preparing for a bigger case. For example, to challenge your legal capacity. The lawyer's words hit me like a cold shower. Legal capacity? I'm perfectly capable of thinking for myself, running the house, and taking care of my sick sister. What could be the problem? Britton explained that modern courts are increasingly faced with attempts by adult children to have their elderly parents declared legally incompetent in order to gain control of their property. They usually start small, the lawyer continued. Accusations of strange behavior, incompetence, meddling in other people's affairs. Then they bring in doctors and social workers. In the end, the court appoints a guardian, most often from among close relatives. I sat in the chair across from his desk and felt the world crumbling around me. Tabitha wants to have me declared incompetent? For what? For the house? For the small pension I receive after Gerard? Or just to get rid of her annoying mother? My memory flashed back to images from the past. Tabitha at 15, when I refused to buy her the expensive jacket that all her classmates wore. She didn't talk to me for 3 days, and then she announced that I was the worst mother in the world and that she would never forgive me. At the time, it seemed like normal teenage rebellion. Now I understood. It was her true nature. At 16, she secretly took my credit card and spent almost $1,000 on clothes. When the deception was revealed, Tabitha did not apologize. On the contrary, she accused me of not understanding the needs of a modern teenager. Gerard wanted to punish her, but I stood up for her. I thought she would become more responsible as she got older. Become as if. In college, Tabitha constantly asked for money for urgent needs. First, her computer broke. Then she needed new textbooks. Then her friends organized a trip that she just had to go on. Each time, she swore it was the last time that she had learned to budget, and each time she called again a month later. After college, things only got worse. Tabitha changed jobs 5 times in 2 years. She found fault with her colleagues, her bosses, and her working conditions everywhere. They don't appreciate my potential, she complained. I deserve better. At the same time, she lived in an expensive apartment that I helped pay for, bought clothes in boutiques, and went to restaurants every weekend. Meeting Reginald seemed like a salvation at first. He was older and seemed more serious and responsible. He had his own business, an interior design studio, and several regular clients. Tabitha fell in love not so much with him as with the lifestyle he promised. Expensive cars, prestigious projects, social gatherings. The reality turned out to be more prosaic. Reginald's business depended on a few wealthy clients who allowed him to feel like an artist rather than a simple decorator. Most of the time, he worked with ordinary customers, remodeling kitchens, choosing wallpaper for bedrooms, advising on furniture placement. His income was unstable, but his expenses were constant. The wedding took place 8 months after they met. Tabitha insisted on a lavish ceremony at a country club, an expensive dress, and live music. "This is the only wedding of my life, Mom," she said. "You can't skimp on your own daughter's happiness." The celebration cost me $15,000, almost half of my annual pension. The first years of marriage were relatively peaceful. Tabitha worked at a beauty salon, and Reginald developed his business. They rented a small apartment and occasionally asked to borrow money, but overall they managed on their own. I hoped that family life would teach my daughter responsibility. But gradually their demands grew. Reginald wanted to expand his studio, and Tabitha dreamed of opening her own salon. They needed investments, guarantors, and advice. Each time they turned to me as if I were a bank that was obliged to help without asking questions. I helped because I didn't know how to refuse. The crisis began 3 years ago when Reginald's biggest client went bankrupt without paying for the last project. The studio was on the verge of closing, and the young family was left without a means of subsistence. Tabitha lost her job at the salon due to a conflict with the owner. They asked for help more and more often and in larger amounts. I gave them money for rent, then for groceries, then to pay off loans. Each time they promised to repay the debt as soon as things got better. But things didn't get better. Reginald couldn't find regular clients, and Tabitha refused to take jobs she considered beneath her. In the end, they lost their apartment. I couldn't let my daughter end up on the street, so I invited them to stay with me. "Temporarily," Tabitha said. until we get back on our feet. That was 2 years ago. Britton interrupted my recollections with a question about the house documents. I had all the necessary papers: the title deed, the purchase agreement, the inheritance documents after Gerard's death. That's good, said the lawyer, but we need to check if they tried to register any rights to the property. Modern fraudsters are very inventive. The idea of possible fraud seemed absurd to me. Tabitha is my daughter, no matter how much we argue. Could she really be capable of such deception? But then I remembered the missing documents, the changed locks, the vanished photographs. Maybe these weren't coincidences? The lawyer asked me to bring all the documents related to the house, as well as any letters or notes from Tabitha and Reginald. People often provide evidence against themselves, he explained, especially when they are sure they are right. I agreed to his services, even though the fee seemed substantial. Britton promised to study the case and prepare a defense for the hearing. The main thing is not to panic, he said as he left. We have time and arguments. On the way home, I stopped by the bank to check my account balance. In recent months, I had hardly kept track of my expenses, trusting Tabitha to pay the bills and buy groceries. It turned out that the account was almost empty. Several large cash withdrawals that I didn't remember. Payments on loans that I hadn't taken out. My heart began to race. I requested a statement for the last 6 months and was horrified by what I saw: regular transfers to Reginald's account, mobile phone bills for unfamiliar numbers, purchases at expensive stores. All of this was charged to my card, but I didn't remember any of these expenses. At home, I found my credit card in its usual place, in my purse in the hallway. But now I understood why Tabitha had been so insistent on helping with shopping and paying bills. She had access to my purse, which meant she had access to my card. How many times had she used it without my knowledge? That evening, I sat in the living room with Britton's documents and bank statements. The house felt foreign and hostile. Tabitha and Reginald's presence was felt in every room. Their belongings, their smells, their plans, plans in which there was no place for me. 2 days ago, I thought the worst thing in my life was the loneliness after Gerard's death. Now I realized that there could be something worse: betrayal by the person closest to me. The courtroom seemed larger than I had expected. High ceilings, heavy wooden benches, a flag in the corner. All of this created an atmosphere of solemnity and inevitability. I sat next to Britton in the front row, trying not to look around. I knew Tabitha and Reginald were sitting somewhere behind me, but I didn't want to see their faces. Judge Wakefield turned out to be a middle-aged man with graying hair and a tired expression on his face. He looked through the documents, adjusted his glasses, and announced the start of the preliminary hearing in the case of Foster v. Callahan. It sounded like a sentence. Tabitha's lawyer, a young woman in a strict suit, stood up first. Celeste Hughes, as she introduced herself to the judge, spoke clearly and confidently, like someone accustomed to winning. There was not a hint of doubt in her voice about the righteousness of her clients. "Your Honor," she began, "my clients are forced to go to court because of systematic persecution by Mrs. Callahan. For 2 years, she has created unbearable living conditions for a young family, interfered in their personal lives, and violated the boundaries of their private space. I listened and couldn't believe my ears. Harassment? Unbearable conditions? Was she talking about me, the woman who took them into my home when they had nowhere else to go?" Hughes continued to lay out the accusations. According to her, I allegedly eavesdropped on Tabitha's conversations with her husband, checked their personal belongings, and made comments about their lifestyle. Mrs. Callahan created an atmosphere of constant control and pressure, said the lawyer. The young people couldn't live peacefully in their own home. In their own home? I could barely restrain myself from jumping up. Britton put his hand on my shoulder and nodded reassuringly. We had agreed in advance that I would remain silent until it was my turn to speak. The judge listened to the opening statement and asked for the testimony to be presented. Tabitha was the first to approach the microphone. She looked pale and confused, nothing like the confident woman I knew. A black dress, minimal makeup, her hair neatly pulled back, the image of a suffering victim. Mom has always been demanding, Tabitha began in a trembling voice, but over the last 2 years, her behavior became unbearable. She constantly monitored us, checking what time we came home, who we talked to on the phone. We couldn't invite friends over because Mom would make comments to them or just stand nearby and listen to our conversations. It wasn't true, and we both knew it. Tabitha had practically no friends, at least none that she could bring home. The few acquaintances who sometimes visited were as irresponsible as she was. I really didn't approve of them, but I never forbade their visits. Mom was always moving our things around, her daughter continued. She would come into our room without knocking and read our private correspondence when we left our phones on the table. We felt like we were in prison, where every move was monitored. I only went into their room to clean, and even then, I warned them first. As for correspondence, I barely knew how to use my own phone, let alone someone else's. Tabitha knew that very well. The judge asked several clarifying questions. Were there specific instances of interference? Did they ask Mrs. Callahan to change her behavior? Tabitha answered vaguely, referring to constant pressure and an atmosphere of mistrust. She couldn't give any specific examples. Reginald was next to speak. He was more confident than his wife, speaking clearly and convincingly. Unlike Tabitha, he had specific complaints. Mrs. Callahan systematically violated our right to privacy, he said. She demanded reports on our spending, controlled our purchases, and made comments about our daily routine. When we tried to discuss personal boundaries with her, she accused us of being ungrateful, demanded an account of our spending. Is he talking about when I asked why the electricity bills had doubled after they moved in? Or when I asked why we needed to spend $200 a week on groceries when I used to get by on $50? Particularly painful was her control over our relationships with friends and colleagues, Reginald continued. Mrs. Callahan openly disapproved of our social circle and made unpleasant comments about our guests. This created a tense atmosphere and interfered with normal social functioning. Social functioning. How pompous that sounded. Yes, I disapproved of some of their acquaintances, especially the guy in the leather jacket who came to Reginald's house at night and loudly discussed some dubious projects, or the woman who constantly complained about her husband and demanded money from Tabitha. Reginald told the judge how I allegedly eavesdropped on their phone conversations, checked their mail, and even followed them during their walks around the neighborhood. We felt like we were under investigation, he concluded. It had a negative impact on our marriage and mental health. Followed them on their walks? I struggled to keep from laughing. At 70, I can barely walk to the store around the corner, let alone follow anyone. And eavesdropping on phone calls is just ridiculous. They talked so loudly that it was impossible not to hear them, especially when they were arguing. The judge listened to the testimony and asked for written evidence. Hughes handed him a folder with documents, photographs, notes, some kind of certificates. I couldn't make out the details, but the amount of paperwork was impressive. They had really prepared thoroughly for this trial. Your Honor, said Tabitha's lawyer, my clients are asking the court to issue a restraining order against Mrs. Callahan and to order her to cease any interference in their private lives. We also request that you consider ordering a medical examination to determine the mental state of the defendant. A medical examination. So Britton was right. They really do want to have me declared incompetent. A restraining order against my own mother in my own home. It's not even funny, it's just crazy. It was my turn. Britton stood up and asked the judge to dismiss the case on the grounds that it was without merit. Your Honor, he said calmly, my client is the owner of the house in which the plaintiffs reside. Mrs. Callahan provided them with housing out of the kindness of her heart when they found themselves in a difficult situation. The allegations of harassment and invasion of privacy have no factual basis. He read several excerpts from the Law on Homeowners' Rights and reminded the court that Tabitha and Reginald did not pay rent and did not have a formal lease agreement. The plaintiffs are trying to use the court to resolve a family conflict, Britton concluded. That is not within the jurisdiction of this court. The judge asked me several questions. Do I confirm that Tabitha is my daughter? Yes. Do they live in my house? Yes. Do they pay rent? No. Are there any written agreements regarding their residence? No. Mrs. Callahan, the judge asked, how would you describe your relationship with your daughter and son-in-law over the past 2 years? I thought carefully as I chose my words. Difficult, Your Honor. I tried to help them through a difficult situation, but gradually I felt like a stranger in my own home. They changed the locks, rearranged the furniture, and removed personal belongings without my consent. I don't understand what they are accusing me of. The judge nodded and announced a half-hour recess to review the documents presented. Britton and I went out into the hallway. The lawyer looked calm, but I could sense his tension. What do you think? I asked. It's too early to tell, he replied, but their position is weak. Too much emotion and not enough facts. The main thing is not to let them draw you into an argument. Answer only specific questions. When we returned to the courtroom, the judge was already seated. He looked through the documents again and raised his head. Having heard the parties, Wakefield said, I find it necessary to schedule a main hearing in this case. The materials presented by the plaintiffs require more detailed consideration. The hearing is scheduled for Thursday of next week at 10 o'clock in the morning. He banged his gavel and the session was adjourned. Tabitha and Reginald quickly left the courtroom without even glancing in my direction. I remained seated on the bench, unable to get up. A main hearing meant that the case was being taken seriously. Don't worry, Britton said. We have a week to prepare, and I don't think the plaintiffs have as much evidence as they would like to show. On the way home, I thought about what had happened in court today. Tabitha and Reginald seemed genuinely convinced that they were right. Maybe they really do think I'm to blame for their problems, or is it just a good act for the judge? In any case, the war between us has officially begun. Thursday came too quickly. I woke up at 6:30 with a heavy feeling in my chest. Today, my fate would be decided. Britton had warned me that the main hearings would be more serious than the preliminary ones. Today, each side had to present all their evidence and witnesses. I couldn't eat breakfast. I drank my coffee and tried to pull myself together. I put on the dark blue dress I had bought for Gerard's funeral. It seemed appropriate for the occasion. The mirror reflected a tired woman with gray hair and deep wrinkles around her eyes. 70 years old, a respectable age to be fighting her own daughter in court. Britton met me at the entrance to the courthouse. He looked composed and confident, although I noticed that he was wearing a new suit. Apparently, he had decided to impress the judge. The lawyer was carrying a thick folder of documents. How are you, Mrs. Callahan? He asked. I'm nervous, I replied honestly. That's normal. Today we'll find out what evidence they have. I've prepared a few surprises for the plaintiffs. There were more people in the courtroom than last time. Besides us, Tabitha, Reginald, and their lawyer, there were several people I didn't recognize. Witnesses, I guess. Tabitha sat up straight, staring ahead. She was wearing the same black dress she wore at the preliminary hearing. Reginald was flipping through some papers, occasionally whispering to the lawyer. Judge Wakefield entered at exactly 10 o'clock. The clerk announced the start of the hearing, and everyone stood up. When we sat back down, I felt my heart beating in my throat. It had begun. Today we are considering the case of Foster versus Callahan, the judge announced. The floor is given to the plaintiff's attorney. Celeste Hughes stood up with a folder in her hands. Today, she looked even more confident than last time. Your Honor, my clients will present the court with irrefutable evidence of systematic persecution and psychological pressure on the part of Mrs. Callahan. We have witnesses, documents, and records to support all of our allegations. The first witness called was Tabitha's neighbor from her former residence. A woman in her 40s, dressed in a strict gray suit, swore to tell the truth and took her place to testify. Mrs. Randolph, Hughes addressed her. How long have you known the Foster family? About 3 years. They rented an apartment in our building before moving in with Tabitha's mother. Tell the court what you observed. The woman recounted how Tabitha had complained to her about the difficulties in her relationship with me. Allegedly, I constantly called, demanded meetings, and criticized their lifestyle. According to the neighbor, Tabitha was under constant stress due to pressure from her mother. It was a distorted version of events, but I couldn't refute it. Yes, I called my daughter, like any mother would. Yes, I sometimes expressed my opinion about their financial problems, but I didn't coerce or harass anyone. The next witness was a young man who introduced himself as Reginald's colleague from his previous job. He talked about how Reginald complained about toxic relationships in his wife's family and asked for advice on how to deal with the situation. Reginald said that his mother-in-law controlled their every move. The witness testified. She demanded reports on all their expenses, checked their correspondence, and made a scene over every little thing. I listened and marveled at the ingenuity of my daughter and son-in-law. When did they manage to create such a detailed picture of my alleged inadequacy? And most importantly, why? Hughes presented the court with recordings of telephone conversations that Tabitha allegedly had with her friends. Of course, the recordings only contained complaints about her mother and requests for moral support. Not a word about the fact that I provided them with free housing and helped them financially. Then they showed photographs as alleged evidence of my interference in their personal lives. In one, I was standing outside their room with a vacuum cleaner. Tabitha had photographed me while I was cleaning. In another, I was sitting in the living room when guests came to visit them. Ordinary, everyday situations were turned into evidence of persecution. The climax of the plaintiff's presentation was a medical document. A certain Dr. Pemberton, a psychiatrist, presented a report stating that prolonged psychological pressure could have a negative impact on the health of the young family. At the same time, he had never seen me or them. The conclusion was based solely on their stories. When the plaintiff's lawyer finished, the judge gave the floor to Britton. My lawyer stood up and glanced calmly around the room. Your Honor, he began, we have heard many emotional stories, but few facts. The plaintiffs are trying to portray normal family relationships as persecution and a mother's care as psychological pressure. At the same time, they are carefully concealing the real reason for this lawsuit. He opened his folder and took out several documents. I would like to present to the court a witness whose testimony will shed light on the real situation. A man in his 50s wearing a postal service uniform approached the witness stand. I recognized Bernard Clifton, who had been delivering mail in our neighborhood for many years. He was a good-natured, thorough man who knew all the residents by name. Mr. Clifton, Britton said, how long have you been working as a mail carrier in the neighborhood where Mrs. Callahan lives? 8 years, Bernard replied in a clear voice. Tell the court about the changes in mail delivery to 23 Oak Street. Bernard cleared his throat and began to speak. About 2 years ago, I began to notice something strange about the mail at this house. First, letters addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Foster appeared at this address. Then they asked for all mail to be forwarded to their names. The courtroom fell silent. I saw Tabitha tense up, and Reginald quickly writing something on a piece of paper. What exactly did they ask for? Britton clarified. Mr. Foster said that they were now the owners of the house and that Mrs. Callahan had moved in with relatives. He asked that all official correspondence be sent to them. They even had a sign with the name The Foster Family on the mailbox. This was news even to me. I knew they were receiving some letters, but I had no idea of the extent of what was going on. Were there any other changes? The lawyer continued. Yes. A month and a half ago, Mr. Foster asked if I could testify that they lived at this address as permanent residents. He said they needed it for the bank. He also asked that no mail addressed to Mrs. Callahan be delivered, if any came. There was a surprised whisper in the courtroom. The judge banged his gavel, demanding silence. Britton took another document out of his folder. Mr. Clifton, do you recognize this envelope? The postman took the envelope and examined it carefully. Yes, it's a letter from the bank that I was supposed to deliver to Mrs. Callahan a month ago. But Mr. Foster said she no longer lived at that address and asked me to return the letter to the sender. And what did you do? I had known Mrs. Callahan for many years and realized that something was wrong. So I decided to bring the letter to her personally when I saw her in the garden or at her house. But she rarely went outside, and when she did, Mr. or Mrs. Foster were always with her. Britton turned to the judge. Your Honor, as you can see, the plaintiffs didn't just live in Mrs. Callahan's house. They systematically pretended to be the owners, intercepted her mail, and prevented her from receiving important documents. Hughes tried to object, but Britton wasn't finished. He called the next witness, a locksmith named Kevin Barlow. The man looked awkward in his suit, clearly uncomfortable in the formal setting. Mr. Barlow, Britton said, tell the court about the work you did at 23 Oak Street. It was about 4 months ago, the locksmith began. I was approached by a man who introduced himself as Reginald Foster. He said he wanted to change the locks on his house for security reasons. What exactly did he ask you to do? To change all the locks, the front door, the back door, the garage door, and to make duplicate keys just for him and his wife. He said that no one else should have access to the house. Did he mention Mrs. Callahan? The locksmith hesitated. Yes, he said something about the previous owner moving out and no longer needing the keys. I didn't go into details. It's none of my business. Did Mr. Foster pay for the work? No, he said he would pay later. He only gave a deposit. He still owes the rest of the money. This fact particularly struck me. Reginald had replaced the locks in my house and hadn't even paid for the work. At the same time, he presented himself as the owner and didn't want to give me the keys. Britton continued to present evidence. He showed the judge copies of utility bills that Tabitha and Reginald had tried to transfer to their names, documents from the bank about attempts to take out a loan secured by my house, recordings of conversations with realtors whom Reginald allegedly called to appraise the property. With each new fact, the picture became clearer. Tabitha and Reginald weren't just living in my house. They were trying to take it over. Gradually, step by step, they were removing me as the legal owner and preparing to take complete possession of the property. The most shocking document was the last one. Britton presented the court with a statement to the Social Services Department that Reginald had submitted a month ago. In it, he requested an examination of the mental state of an elderly relative who allegedly posed a danger to those around her. Mr. Foster claimed in the statement that Mrs. Callahan was suffering from senile dementia and needed to be forcibly hospitalized. Britton read. He identified himself as her official guardian, even though he had no guardianship documents. Silence fell over the courtroom. Even the judge looked shocked by the scale of the deception. Tabitha sat pale as a sheet, and Reginald nervously fiddled with his pen. The judge announced a 15-minute recess. When Britton and I stepped out into the hallway, I felt my hands shaking. The scale of my daughter's betrayal exceeded all my expectations. They didn't just want to drive me out of the house, they planned to have me declared incompetent and take possession of all my property. After the recess, the atmosphere in the courtroom had changed. Judge Wakefield seemed more focused, and the plaintiff's attorney, Celeste Hughes, was clearly nervous. Tabitha and Reginald sat with their heads down, avoiding looking in my direction. The testimony of the postman and the locksmith had dealt a serious blow to their case. Britton stood up and addressed the judge. Your Honor, I would like to present a few more documents that will finally clarify the situation. He opened a new folder and took out a thick stack of papers. These are credit bureau reports on Mr. and Mrs. Foster for the past 2 years, the lawyer explained. As you can see, they took out several loans, listing their address as 23 Oak Street. At the same time, they are listed in the documents as the owners of this property. The judge took the documents and studied them carefully. I saw his eyebrows draw closer together. Mr. Britton, are you claiming that the defendants used someone else's property as collateral? That's right, Your Honor. The first loan for $15,000 was taken out in March last year for home repairs and improvements. The second, for $20,000, was taken out in August, supposedly for the development of a family business. In both cases, Mr. Foster provided documents listing him as the owner of the property at the specified address. That explained a lot. Now I understood where they got the money for the expensive furniture that suddenly filled the house, the new TV in the living room, the leather sofa they installed without my permission. I thought Reginald had finally found a good job, but it turned out they were just taking out loans against my house. Britton continued, but that's not all. Mr. Foster registered his design studio, Elegant Interiors, at this address. The company is listed at 23 Oak Street, and the house itself is listed as office space and a showroom. The judge looked up from the documents. So they used a private residence as commercial property? That's right. What's more, the studio received several municipal benefits as a small business based in the private sector. The total amount of benefits was about $8,000 over a year and a half. I struggled to contain my indignation. So while I was visiting my sick sister, they not only lived in my house, but also made money from it. They registered a business, received benefits, and brought in clients. My house had become their commercial enterprise. Britton called a new witness, a representative of the tax service, a middle-aged woman in a strict gray suit. She confirmed that Elegant Interiors was indeed registered at my address and was taking advantage of tax breaks for home offices. Mrs. Wilson, Britton addressed her. Did Mr. Foster receive any additional benefits or subsidies? Yes, as part of a small business support program, his studio received a grant of $3,000 to purchase equipment. He also applied for a subsidy to expand his office space, but it is still under review. A subsidy to expand his office in my house. I imagined how Reginald planned to remodel the rooms for his own needs with government money, passing off my home as his own property. The next document was Reginald's correspondence with the bank about refinancing his mortgage. In the letters, he presented himself as the sole owner of the house and asked to review the terms of a loan he never took out. The bank had already begun the process of appraising the property for the new loan. Your Honor, Britton said, as you can see, this is not a family dispute, but a serious case of fraud. The defendants systematically pretended to be the owners of someone else's property and used it for financial gain. Hughes tried to object. Your Honor, my clients lived in this house as members of the family. They had every right to consider it their home. The right to consider it your home and the right to use it as collateral are two different things, the judge replied sharply. Continue, Mr. Britton. My lawyer presented another unexpected document, a contract with a real estate agency. It turned out that a month ago, Reginald had asked the real estate agency to appraise the house for sale. In the contract, he is listed as the sole owner, and I am listed as an elderly relative who has moved into a nursing home. The real estate agent, a man in his 40s wearing an expensive suit, confirmed this information. Mr. Foster said he wanted to sell the house as soon as possible, he said. He explained that his aunt was ill and needed money for treatment. He asked us to appraise the property and prepare the documents for a quick sale. My aunt. They were going to sell my house by pretending I was Reginald's sick aunt. The scale of their plans was astonishing in its audacity. First, declare me incapacitated, then establish guardianship, and then sell the property under the pretext of paying for medical treatment. Britton continued to unravel the picture of deception. He showed the judge recordings of telephone conversations with utility companies in which Reginald demanded that all accounts be transferred to his name. Letters to the insurance company requesting a change of beneficiary on the homeowner's policy. Even an application to connect the internet for the design studio's office. Your Honor, said the lawyer, the defendants did not just live in Mrs. Callahan's house. They methodically took control of her property, planning to completely alienate her from it. Their every action was aimed at ousting the rightful owner and appropriating the property. I was particularly struck by a document from the district management company. It turned out that Tabitha had filed a complaint about an elderly woman who is causing problems in the house. In the complaint, she asked for help resolving the situation with an inadequate relative who is interfering with the normal life of the family. The manager of the company, an elderly man with a gray beard, told me about Tabitha's visit 3 weeks ago. She came in very upset, saying that there was a sick old woman living in the house who was behaving aggressively. She asked for advice on the forced eviction of persons with mental disorders. Forced eviction from my own home. I couldn't believe my daughter was capable of such a thing. The woman I gave birth to and raised, whom I had helped all my life, was planning to throw me out on the street like a useless thing. Britton presented another document to the court, a medical certificate that Reginald had tried to obtain from the family doctor. In his request, he claimed to be the guardian of an elderly relative and needed a certificate of her mental state for social services. Dr. Henderson, our family doctor for 20 years, looked indignant. Mr. Foster came to see me a month ago, he said. He claimed that Mrs. Callahan was under his care and needed to be forcibly hospitalized. He asked for a certificate stating that she was a danger to herself and others. What did you say? Britton asked. I said that Mrs. Callahan had been my patient for many years, that she was fully competent and did not need any psychiatric help. Moreover, I saw no reason to declare her incompetent. Mr. Foster was very upset and hinted that he would consult another doctor. So they were looking for a doctor who would agree to diagnose me for money. Fortunately, Dr. Henderson turned out to be an honest man. The culmination was the last document, a copy of the will that someone had tried to file with the registry. The will stated that I was transferring the entire house and property to my beloved daughter Tabitha and her husband Reginald in gratitude for their care in my old age. The document was dated last month and signed, supposedly by me. The handwriting expert, a woman in her 50s with glasses, concluded that the signature was forged. It's a pretty good imitation, she said, but there are characteristic differences in the pressure and shape of the letters. This document was not signed by Mrs. Callahan. The forged will was the final nail in the coffin for the plaintiff's case. Judge Wakefield looked extremely serious as he studied the evidence presented. There was a tense silence in the courtroom. Hughes tried to defend her clients. Your Honor, there may have been some misunderstandings, but that does not negate the basic fact that Mrs. Callahan did create unbearable living conditions for the young family. Mrs. Hughes, the judge interrupted her sharply. Your clients presented false documents to the court, forged a will, and systematically deceived government agencies. This is no longer a civil case, but a criminal one. Tabitha suddenly burst into tears, loudly, theatrically, like when she was a child and wanted to avoid punishment. Reginald tried to take her hand, but she pushed him away. For the first time in the entire proceedings, their alliance had cracked. "Your Honor," Hughes said in a trembling voice, "I request time to consult with my clients." The judge looked at his watch. "The hearing is adjourned. The decision will be announced tomorrow at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Until then, I recommend that the plaintiff seriously consider the possibility of admitting guilt and paying damages." When everyone began to leave, I remained seated in my place. The scale of my daughter's betrayal was much greater than I could have imagined. It was not a family quarrel, but a real conspiracy against me. Tabitha and Reginald had planned to steal my entire life, my house, my money, even my identity. Britton put his hand on my shoulder. "Mrs. Callahan, you've won the case. Tomorrow the judge will rule in your favor, I'm sure of it." But victory brought no joy. I had lost my daughter, perhaps forever. The evening after the trial was long. I sat in the living room with a cup of cold tea and looked at the familiar furniture, which now seemed foreign. After everything I had heard today, the house seemed saturated with lies. Every object reminded me of the deception. The new TV bought on credit, the leather sofa they had installed without permission. Even the lamp in the corner had been replaced with a more expensive one. The phone rang around 9 in the evening. Tabitha's number appeared on the display. The first time in 3 weeks she had decided to call me. I stared at the phone for a long time, not daring to answer. What could she say after everything that had happened? What words could explain the extent of her betrayal? Finally, I picked up the phone. My daughter's voice sounded broken, nothing like the confident woman who had sat next to her lawyer in the courtroom that morning. "Mom," Tabitha began, her voice breaking, "I need to talk to you. Can I come home?" Home? She still called my house her home, even after being exposed in court. I couldn't tell if the word was spoken out of habit or audacity. "Talk on the phone," I replied curtly. "No, Mom, please. I can't discuss this on the phone. I have to explain everything to you. What happened in court today? It's all a lie." A lie? After all the documents, witness statements, and the fake will, she was still trying to deny the obvious. But there was something new in my daughter's voice. Not anger or indignation, but genuine fear. Half an hour later, Tabitha was standing on the porch. She looked terrible, tear-stained, disheveled, in a crumpled dress. Her makeup was smudged, her hands were shaking. In the 2 days since the preliminary hearing, she had aged several years. I opened the door but didn't invite her in. "Mom," she began as soon as she crossed the threshold, "I know how this looks, but it's not what it seems. I never wanted to hurt you." We went into the living room. Tabitha sat down on the edge of the sofa, the very one we had bought with the money borrowed against my house. I remained standing by the window, keeping my distance. After everything I had heard in court, I couldn't relax around my daughter. "Explain," I said curtly. Tabitha covered her face with her hands and burst into tears, loudly, with sobs, like when she was a child. But now those tears didn't make me feel sorry for her. There had been too many lies between us. "It's all Reg's fault," she began, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. "I didn't know about most of these things. I swear, Mom, I had no idea he was taking out loans on the house or forging the will. But you knew about the lock change. You knew he was introducing himself as the owner of the house to the neighbors and the mailman," I said calmly. Tabitha hesitated. "Yes, I knew about that. But he explained that it was temporary, for safety. He said there had been a spate of burglaries in the area and we needed to be careful. As for the mail, he said you asked him to forward your correspondence while you were staying with Aunt Dorothy." Lie after lie. Even now, when everything had been revealed, she continued to evade the question. I had lived with my daughter long enough to know when she was lying. The little signs, her averted gaze, her nervous lip biting, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her clothes. What about the design studio registered at my house? I continued my interrogation. Mom, I don't know anything about business matters, Tabitha sobbed. Reg said we needed an official address for the company. I thought you wouldn't mind. You're off and away visiting Dorothy anyway. So, in her opinion, my trips to visit my sick sister gave them the right to treat the house as their own, to turn the living rooms into an office, bring in clients, and receive government benefits. Tabitha, I said slowly, do you seriously think I'll believe in your innocence? After the fake will? After trying to have me declared incompetent? My daughter raised her head sharply. What will? What incompetence? Mom, this is the first I've heard of it. Now she was resorting to outright lies. I saw her face in court when Britton presented the evidence. I saw her turn pale with each new document. Did she really think I would forget about it in a few hours? Reginald filed a petition with social services to have my mental state examined, I said harshly. He presented himself as my guardian and claimed that I was a danger to those around me. You didn't know anything about this? Tabitha was silent for a long time. Then she said quietly, he said he was worried about your health. You've been so strange lately, forgetful, suspicious. We thought you needed help. What kind of help? Forced hospitalization? No, my daughter exclaimed. Just a doctor's consultation. Reg said he wanted to make sure you were okay. She was lying, and we both knew it. But Tabitha continued to spin her version of events, in which she was the innocent victim of her husband's manipulation. Mom, you have to believe me, she continued in a pleading tone. I never wanted to hurt you. Yes, maybe I wasn't the most attentive daughter. Maybe I trusted Reg too much. But I love you and would never participate in any schemes against you. Then explain the complaint to the management company, I demanded, where you asked for help in forcibly evicting an inadequate relative. Was that Reginald's idea too? Tabitha cried again. I was desperate, Mom. Our relationship was getting worse and worse. You were constantly dissatisfied with us. Reg said you wanted to kick us out, that you were looking for a reason to cause a scandal. I went to the management company to ask for advice on how to improve family relations. Advice on improving relations or instructions on eviction. In court, the manager clearly stated that Tabitha had asked about the forced eviction of persons with mental disorders, but she continued to insist on her version. What about the loans? I pressed. Did you sign documents with our address on them? Reg said it was a formality, Tabitha replied listlessly, that the bank needed a permanent address to process a business development loan. I didn't read the fine print. I just trusted my husband. Just trusted him. How convenient to shift all the responsibility onto Reginald. But I remembered how they chose new furniture together, how happy they were with their purchases, how they planned the renovation. Did Tabitha seriously think I would believe she had nothing to do with it? Where is your husband now? I asked. Tabitha paused. We had a fight after the trial. He went to stay with his brother in Baltimore. He said he needed to think about what to do next. So he left you to deal with the consequences alone. Mom, he didn't leave. We're both in shock from what's happening. We need time to think things through. But I saw the truth in her eyes. Reginald had indeed run away, leaving his wife to take the blame for their crimes. The ship was sinking, and the rats were the first to abandon it. Tabitha finally understood what kind of man she had tied her life to. Mom, her daughter said quietly, I know it all looks terrible. I know you don't believe me, but give me a chance to make it right. I'll divorce Reg, return all the money he took. We can start over. Start over. As if 2 years of deception and betrayal could be erased. as if the fake will and attempts to have me declared incompetent could be forgotten. How are you going to pay back the money? I asked pragmatically. You don't have a job. You don't have any savings. You have nothing but debts. Tabitha hesitated. I'll find a job. I'll sell my car, my jewelry, everything I have. I'll pay you back in installments, as much as it takes. What about the house? Are you prepared to formally renounce any claim to it? Of course, Mom. The house is yours. That's indisputable. I'll sign any documents. The words sounded right, but something in Tabitha's tone was alarming. Too quick answers, too ready decisions, as if she had rehearsed this speech in advance. We sat in silence for a few minutes. It was getting dark outside, and the lights were coming on. It was a typical autumn evening in a quiet neighborhood where the neighbors had no idea of the drama unfolding in one of the houses. Mom, Tabitha broke the silence, tell me you forgive me. I know I was a bad daughter. I know I disappointed you. But we're family, right? Blood is thicker than water. Family, blood is thicker than water. Cliched phrases she had hidden behind all her life when she needed to avoid responsibility. It worked when I was a child. I forgave her tantrums, hysterics, and petty lies. In my youth, I turned a blind eye to her irresponsibility, selfishness, and consumerist attitude towards her parents. But now it wasn't about childish pranks. Tabitha and her husband planned to steal my life, take away my home, and have me declared incompetent. This was not a family conflict, but a real crime. Tabitha, I said calmly, tomorrow the court will make its decision. After that, we'll talk about your future. My daughter understood that the conversation was over. She got up from the sofa, wiped her eyes, and headed for the exit. At the door, she turned around and said, Mom, I really love you, no matter what. The door closed, and I was left alone in the house that I almost lost because of my own gullibility. Love without respect, without honesty, without basic human dignity. What is it worth? On the morning of the verdict, I woke up with the feeling that my life would be divided into before and after. Whatever the wording of the court's verdict, my relationship with Tabitha would never be the same again. Too much truth had come out in the courtroom, and the betrayal and deception had proven too deep. I wore the same dark blue suit I had worn to the first hearing. The mirror reflected a tired woman who had aged over the past few weeks, but my eyes showed determination. I was no longer a naive mother, ready to forgive anything for the sake of family peace. Britton was waiting for me at the courthouse entrance. He looked confident, although I noticed traces of a sleepless night on his face. The lawyer had clearly spent a lot of time studying all the documents and preparing for possible objections from the plaintiffs. How are you feeling, Mrs. Callahan? He asked as we climbed the steps of the courthouse. To be honest, I'm tired of all this, I replied. I want it to be over. It will be over today, Britton promised. At least the court part. There were more people in the courtroom than usual. In addition to those involved in the case, there were some unfamiliar faces, perhaps journalists or just curious onlookers. The family fraud case had attracted public attention. Tabitha sat in the front row next to her lawyer. Reginald was not there. Apparently, he had indeed fled to Baltimore, leaving his wife to deal with the consequences of their joint crimes. His daughter looked pale and confused, nothing like the confident woman who had filed a lawsuit against her own mother a few weeks ago. Celeste Hughes did not look her best either. The lawyer clearly understood that the case was lost, but professional ethics required her to fight to the end. She was holding a thin folder in her hands. Apparently, no new arguments could be found. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Judge Wakefield entered the courtroom. Everyone stood up. He took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and looked around the courtroom with a serious expression. He was holding a thick folder with the case materials. Please be seated, said the judge. Today I will announce my decision in the case of Foster versus Callahan. This case was considered a civil suit for protection from harassment and invasion of privacy. However, during the hearings, circumstances emerged that required a more serious legal assessment. The judge opened the folder and began to read the decision. His voice was clear and official, each word weighed and considered. Having reviewed the evidence presented, heard the testimony of the witnesses, and examined all the documents, the court has reached the following conclusions. First, the plaintiffs, Tabitha and Reginald Foster, have failed to present convincing evidence of harassment or unlawful interference in their private lives by the defendant. A good start. I felt the tension in my shoulders ease a little. Secondly, the judge continued, during the proceedings, it was established that the plaintiff systematically violated the defendant's property rights by using her real estate for their own gain without the consent of the legal owner. Tabitha clasped her hands together, her knuckles turning white. She understood where the judge was going with this. Thirdly, the evidence presented shows that the plaintiffs committed a series of acts that could be classified as fraud, document forgery, and attempted unlawful appropriation of another's property. A surprised whisper rippled through the courtroom. The judge banged his gavel, demanding silence. Based on the foregoing, the court rules the lawsuit filed by plaintiffs Tabitha and Reginald Foster against Evelyn Callahan is dismissed in its entirety. All charges of harassment and invasion of privacy are found to be without merit. I felt a huge sense of relief. Officially, my innocence had been proven and the charges dropped. But the judge continued. Furthermore, the court orders the plaintiffs to immediately vacate the premises at 23 Oak Street, which are owned by the defendant. The deadline for vacating the premises is 7 days from the date the decision takes effect. 7 days. Tabitha had to leave the home she had considered her own for the past 2 years. My daughter turned abruptly to me, her eyes filled with pleading and despair. The court also orders the plaintiffs to compensate the defendant for material damages in the amount of $28,000, the amount of illegally obtained loans, benefits, and subsidies. Payment must be made within 6 months. $28,000. An impressive amount for people without a steady income. Tabitha and Reginald did not have that kind of money, and we all understood that. The case materials are being sent to the prosecutor's office to decide whether to initiate criminal proceedings for fraud, forgery of documents, and attempted unlawful appropriation of another's property. A criminal case. So, the story doesn't end there. Tabitha and Reginald will have to answer not only to me, but also to the state. The court's decision is final and cannot be appealed. The judge concluded. The hearing is adjourned. The bang of the gavel put an end to this story. People in the courtroom began to leave, but Tabitha remained seated. She stared into space, apparently trying to comprehend the magnitude of what had happened. Hughes approached her, whispered something, and left. The lawyer had done her job, albeit unsuccessfully, and was no longer obligated to support her client. Tabitha was left alone to face the consequences of her actions. I approached Britton, who was putting documents into his briefcase. "Thank you for everything," I said. "I couldn't have done it without you." "It's my job, Mrs. Callahan. The important thing is that justice prevailed." Justice is a big word, but was it fair that mother and daughter were now enemies? Was it fair to the broken family, the lost trust, the years of deception and lies? When we left the courtroom, Tabitha caught up with us in the hallway. She looked completely lost, like a child who had gotten separated from her parents in a crowd. "Mom," she called in a trembling voice, "please wait." I stopped, but didn't turn around. Britton discreetly stepped aside, giving us a chance to talk alone. "Mom, I understand that you're angry with me," Tabitha began. "I understand that it all looks terrible. But 7 days, it's so little. I have nowhere to go, no money, no job. Reggie left me. I have nothing left. My daughter's voice was filled with real tears, not theatrical sobs like last night, but the quiet despair of someone who had hit rock bottom. You could have thought about that earlier, I said without turning around. When you were planning to have me declared incompetent and sell my house. Mom, I swear I didn't know about the will and the other documents. It was all Reggie's idea. But you knew enough to keep quiet and reap the rewards. Tabitha came closer. I smelled the familiar scent of her perfume. Too sweet, too cloying. She wore the same perfume as a teenager, thinking she was very grown up. Give me another chance, she begged. I'll make amends, find a job, pay back all the money. Can I stay in the house for another month? At least 2 weeks? I need time to find a place to live. I turned and looked at my daughter. Standing before me was a 40-year-old woman who had spent her entire life relying on her parents to solve her problems. Even now, after the trial, after all her schemes had been exposed, she still refused to take responsibility for herself. Tabitha, the court's decision is final, I said calmly. You have 7 days. But Mom? 7 days, I repeated more firmly, and I will strictly monitor compliance with the court's decision. My daughter realized that persuasion was useless. A familiar anger flashed in her eyes, the same anger I had seen in her childhood when Tabitha didn't get what she wanted. So you're really throwing your own daughter out on the street, she said bitterly, after everything we've been through together. You chose the path of deception and betrayal, I replied. I'm just protecting what belongs to me. Tabitha turned and walked toward the exit. Her footsteps echoed in the long hallway of the courthouse. I watched her go, knowing that this might be our last meeting as mother and daughter. Britton came up to me as Tabitha disappeared around the corner. A difficult decision, he said sympathetically. But the right one, I replied. It's time I realized that. The autumn sun was shining outside. A light breeze blew yellow leaves across the sidewalk. Life went on, despite family dramas and broken relationships. I had to learn to live again, without my daughter, but also without her lies. Tabitha moved out 6 days later. I didn't see her pack her things. I spent the whole day at Dorothy's, who supported me during those difficult days. When I returned in the evening, the house greeted me with an unusual silence. The keys to the new locks were lying on the kitchen table next to a note. I'm sorry, Mom. I hope you'll forgive me someday. I took the keys and went around the house. Tabitha had taken only her personal belongings, clothes, cosmetics, a few books. The furniture they had bought on credit remained in place. The expensive TV in the living room, the leather sofa, the new curtains, all of it now served as a reminder of 2 years of deception. The first thing I did was call a locksmith, not the one Reginald had hired, but a trusted craftsman who had been working in our neighborhood for many years. The old locks turned out to be of good quality, so there was no point in replacing them. The locksmith simply made new keys and installed an additional chain on the front door. Would you like to install an alarm system? He asked, looking at the windows on the first floor. I thought about it. No, not yet. An alarm system protected against strangers, and the most dangerous people had already been living in my house for 2 years. The next day, I started sorting through the things my daughter had left behind. It wasn't out of revenge or anger. I just couldn't stand seeing things associated with deception anymore. In Tabitha's closet, I found documents she had forgotten to take with her, or perhaps she had left them on purpose, hoping I wouldn't look into them. Among the papers were copies of loan agreements with my forged signature, correspondence with realtors about selling the house, even a draft advertisement for renting rooms to students. Apparently, they planned to turn my house into a dormitory. Each document revealed a new facet of their plans. I was particularly struck by the notes in Tabitha's notebook. In neat handwriting, she kept track of all my habits and weaknesses. Mom forgets to turn off the lights in the basement. You could say she has memory problems. She confuses the names of her neighbors, a sign of senile dementia. Sometimes talks to herself in the kitchen, evidence of inadequacy. My daughter planned to use normal age-related changes as evidence of my incapacity. For months, she collected compromising information on her own mother, recording every little thing that could be interpreted against me. In the drawer of the dresser was a medical report from a private psychiatrist, Dr. Emerson, a name I had never heard before. The certificate stated that, based on the accounts of relatives, the patient Evelyn Callahan could be suspected of developing dementia. Additional examinations and possible hospitalization were recommended. The certificate was dated a month earlier, so while I was caring for Dorothy, Tabitha was already gathering documents to have me declared incompetent. A doctor who had never seen me was willing to make a diagnosis for money. I clenched the report in my fist, then tore it into small pieces. Some betrayals are so deep that they cannot be forgiven. A mother's love has limits, although it took me 70 years to understand that. While sorting through the kitchen cabinets, I found a stack of letters hidden between the pots and pans. My mail, which Tabitha and Reginald had been intercepting for the past few months. Bills I hadn't received. Notices from the bank about transactions on my card. Letters from the insurance company about an attempt to change the beneficiary. One letter in particular caught my attention. It was from the municipality, dated 3 months earlier. It stated that property tax benefits needed to be reissued due to a change of ownership. Attached to the letter was a copy of the application Reginald had submitted, claiming that he had inherited the house from his late mother-in-law. Late. Not only were they planning to have me declared incompetent, but they had already started filing paperwork as if I were dead. In their plans, I was superfluous not only as the owner of the house, but as a living person in general. In the evening, I sat in the living room with a box of documents next to me and thought about the years I had lived, about where I had gone wrong as a mother. Maybe I had spoiled Tabitha too much as a child? Had I forgiven her whims and selfishness too often? Or, on the contrary, had I not been strict enough? Gerard always said that I was too soft on my daughter. "Evi, you give her everything she asks for," my husband would say. "How will she learn to appreciate what she has?" But I thought that parental love should be unconditional. Now I understood that boundless love turns into indulgence. The phone rang around 9 in the evening. It was Dorothy, calling as she had every day since the trial ended. "How are you, sis?" she asked solicitously. "Sorting through the remnants of my old life," I replied honestly. "I found some documents that Tabitha left behind." "Anything important?" I told her about the medical certificate and the letter from the municipality. Dorothy listened silently, sighing occasionally. "Evi, I understand how much it hurts," she said finally, "but you did the right thing. Some people can't be saved, even if they're your children. Sometimes I wonder, what if she really didn't know about the worst things? What if Reginald made it all up? Sis, you read her notes yourself. She kept a diary of your supposed oddities. This isn't an impulsive decision. It's a systematic effort. Dorothy was right. Tabitha was not an innocent victim of her husband's manipulation. She actively participated in the conspiracy against me, perhaps even initiating it. Reginald is a weak man, accustomed to going with the flow. The idea of having me declared incompetent could well have been Tabitha's. The following week, I began to restore the house to its former appearance. I removed the expensive furniture that had been bought with stolen money. I put back the photos of Gerard that Tabitha had hidden in the basement. I hung the old curtains that my husband and I had chosen 30 years ago. My neighbor, Mrs. Fleming, helped me with the rearrangement. The elderly woman had known our family for many years and had witnessed the whole story with Tabitha. Evelyn, I always felt that something was wrong with your daughter, she said, moving a chair in the living room. But I didn't think it was that serious. Did you notice something? I asked. In recent months, they've been acting like they own the place. Tabitha told the mailman that you had moved into a nursing home, and Reginald told my husband that he was planning to sell the property for development. So the neighbors knew more than I thought. They saw my own daughter driving me out of my home, but they didn't dare interfere in family matters. Now I understand them. Who would believe that a daughter is capable of such betrayal? A month later, the house was back to normal. I put the wedding photo that Tabitha had accidentally broken back in the bedroom. The photo was restored. There was a crack between me and Gerard, but our faces remained intact. Symbolic. Music played in the living room again. Old records that my husband and I used to listen to in the evenings. Tabitha called them antiques. But for me, each melody was part of happy memories. Now, I could listen to them without judgmental looks and comments. I started reading the books I had put off for the last 2 years, cooking meals that Tabitha and Reginald didn't like, watching movies they found boring. Gradually, I remembered what I was like before my life became subject to the whims of my adult children. In the winter, a letter arrived from Tabitha's lawyer. She asked for a meeting to discuss the possibility of reconciliation. She wrote about how sorry she was for what had happened and how she dreamed of restoring our relationship. I read the letter and tore it up. Some bridges, once burned, cannot be rebuilt. In the spring, the criminal trial began. Britain warned me that I might be called as a witness, but that didn't happen. There was enough evidence without my testimony. Tabitha received a 1-year suspended sentence and was ordered to pay damages. Reginald, who was eventually found in Baltimore, received a 2-year prison sentence. I did not attend the sentencing. I didn't want to see my daughter in the courtroom as a criminal. Some images are better left unremembered. Now, a year after the trial ended, I can honestly say that life has gotten better. Yes, I lost my daughter. Yes, it hurts to think about how easily she was willing to betray me. But I have found a peace that I haven't known in many years. The house is mine again, not only legally, but also emotionally. I run it as I please, make decisions on my own, without looking back at other people's opinions. At 70, I have finally become truly independent. Sometimes I think about Tabitha. I ask Dorothy if she has heard anything, but I don't plan to actively seek contact. My mother's love has not disappeared, but it no longer controls my decisions. I have learned to distinguish love from self-sacrifice, care from indulgence. Dorothy often says that I have become a different person, stronger, more confident. Evi, you've finally grown up, my sister jokes. And she's right. It took 70 years and the betrayal of my own daughter for me to realize that some relationships do more harm than good, even if they are family ties.